You cannot do that by continually piling more taxes and more regulations and more mandates and more requirements on the very people that create jobs. The American people deserve better. We can do better, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida is recognized.
Mr. President, as a courtesy to Senator Inhofe, I'd ask consent that Senator Inhofe be recognized after my remarks.
Without objection.
A unanimous consent request, if you would. I request that at the conclusion of the Senator's remarks, the Senator from Florida, that the Senator from Wyoming be recognized, and I be recognized after the Senator from Wyoming for up to 35 minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida is recognized.
Mr. President, on the battlefield, there's a code among the military that you don't leave anybody behind. And that principle ought to apply to our returning veterans from overseas as well, because it's essential for us to care for our veterans when they get home and to show them the same respect and loyalty that they have showed us during their service. And during this economic downturn, it's been especially tough for many of our veterans as they come back from Iraq and Afghanistan. The unemployment rate among veterans returning from those two countries has been 9.5% in June. And while this is clearly an improvement for the returning veterans, as is the improvement in the entire economy over the last couple of years, it is still more than a point of unemployment higher than the national average. And for some of the youngest veterans, it's even worse. It's 29% in last year, 2011. Well, our service members have already done the toughest jobs out there. They are highly trained, they are extremely skilled, and we ought to give them as many opportunities as possible to succeed when they get home. That means when veterans come back from war, they shouldn't have to do battle with bureaucrats. And so I want to make a suggestion to the Senate, a common sense suggestion. And I filed a bill which recently passed both the House and the Senate to remove some of those bureaucratic obstacles in our veterans' way and to make it easier for them to get occupational and professional licenses when they get home. So the Veterans Skill to Jobs Act, it's a bipartisan bill co-sponsored by 16 senators, supported by veterans organizations like the American Legion. And Mr. President, I would ask consent that the American Legion's commentary on this be entered in the congressional record.
Without objection.
What the bill does is direct the federal agencies to recognize relevant military training when certifying veterans for federal occupational licenses. In other words, it's common sense. If a veteran is skilled because they've been trained in their military duties, they ought to be able to utilize that skill, that training, without having to go through all of it duplicated again when they get into a specialized civilian job. So this bill directs the federal agencies to recognize relevant military training when certifying veterans for federal occupational licenses. If the military training is found to be comparable to the civilian requirements, the veteran would be deemed qualified for that occupation. These are the licenses that people need in order to get jobs in the civilian sector. And I want to give you a couple of examples. Say an Air Force or Navy aircraft mechanic gets out of the service, they may want to use those skills learned in the military to work in the commercial airline business. Well, to do so, that veteran must be certified as an aircraft mechanic technician certified by the Federal Aviation Administration. And this requires an airframes and power plant license from the FAA. Though the veteran has trained to do this highly skilled occupation for our military, what we're seeing all too often, common sense goes out of the window, and that veteran may have to go through redundant and expensive training to get that airframes and power plant license. And, of course, that doesn't make sense. And this isn't just a federal issue. Many states are starting to recognize military training when certifying veterans for state licenses, like nurses and truck drivers. I'm pleased that the federal government will now move in this direction as well. We've already passed it unanimously here in the Senate. Likewise, they've passed it in the House. Both bills are down in the others' respective chambers. And so we need to go ahead and pass this, and I think it's going to be sent around, and I know of no objection to this since we got it out of the Senate unanimously. Mr. President, one of the greatest honors I have in my job is getting to meet and thank veterans and our current members of our military and all our national security apparatus. It's up to us to stand by these folks. And so passing this legislation to help employ veterans, like the Veterans Skills to Jobs Act, is one way that we can thank them. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President. Senator from Wyoming's recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today, as I do week after week, ever since the President's health care law has been passed, to offer a doctor's second opinion about this health care law, which I believe is bad for patients. It's bad for providers, the nurses and the doctors who take care of those patients, and it's terrible for taxpayers. Well, what we saw, Mr. President, is that the Supreme Court issued its historic decision on the President's health care law. The court confirmed, Mr. President, that the individual mandate in the President's health care law is a tax. The President said it wasn't a tax, but I will just tell you the Supreme Court confirmed that it is, in fact, a tax. And the decision makes it clear that the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, will now play an unprecedented role in America's health care system. That is not something that the American citizens have asked for or want, but it is something many American citizens fear. Recently, the Associated Press highlighted this concern in an article titled, "Taxman Cometh to Police You on Health Care." Taxman cometh to police you on health care. The article points out that the health care law contains the largest set of tax changes in more than 20 years. The largest set of tax changes in more than 20 years. To be specific, according to the Congressional Budget Office, there are at least 18 separate taxes contained in the health care law. These taxes are expected to cost taxpayers more than $500 million over the next 10 years. The Associated Press points out that the IRS is expected to spend over $880 million just to implement the law from 2010 to 2013, and to do this, they're going to hire more than 2,700 new government workers. Well, Mr. President, this could be just the tip of the iceberg. According to a report issued by the House Ways and Means Committee, the Internal Revenue Service, yes, the IRS, may need as many as 16,500 additional bureaucrats to enforce the President's health care law, now the President's health care tax. One of these taxes that the agents are going to be enforcing is something called the individual mandate. This is the part of the law that forces every American to have health insurance. If they don't have it, the law forces them to purchase health insurance. And not just any health insurance. No, 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 not at all. They need to purchase government-approved health insurance. Not necessarily something that that family thinks is right for them and their needs and their insurance and their family. No, that's not good enough. They have to purchase government-approved insurance, and the IRS is going to check on them to make sure that they do. According to the Congressional Budget Office, 77% of those forced to pay the tax will be people making less than $120,000 a year. Well, Mr. President, President Obama repeatedly promised that he would not raise taxes on the middle class. Specifically, he promised that no family making less than $250,000 a year would see any form of tax increase. Well, let me just quote. The President of the United States said, and I quote, he said, "I can make a firm pledge." He said, "Under my plan, no family making less than $250,000 a year will see any form of tax increase." The President went on to say, not your income tax. He said, not your payroll tax. He said, not your capital gains tax. He finished it by saying, not any of your taxes. But when the President's lawyers went before the Supreme Court, they did just the opposite. They argued that this mandate was indeed a tax. The Solicitor General even stated that the court had an obligation, he said, to construe the mandate as a tax. He said if it could be upheld on that basis. So as it turns out, a majority of the Supreme Court agreed that the mandate was constitutional, but only because it's a tax. In short, the Supreme Court confirmed that the President has broken his promise to middle-class families, and it's the promise that he made to not raise taxes. In fact, the President's individual mandate tax will produce more tax revenue for the government than the so-called Buffett rule that this administration has been supporting. While supporters of the health care law may support using the IRS to scare people into getting health insurance, most Americans don't think that this is the right policy for our country. Back when Congress was debating this health care law, the American people were looking for reform, health care reform, that would actually lower the cost of care, not raise their taxes. They wanted a law that helped train more doctors and more nurses to take care of them, not more tax collectors to look into their life and their records. The last thing they want is the IRS breathing down their neck and banging down their doors. But that's what the American people have gotten through the President's health care law. And that's what they are stuck with unless Congress and the White House repeal and replace this flawed and failed law. As a physician with 25 years of experience taking care of families all around Wyoming, I believe there's a better way. We can implement common sense reforms in a step-by-step way that allow people to purchase insurance across state lines, that reform medical liability laws, that strengthen state high-risk pools. These simple changes will help lower the cost of care without forcing millions of Americans to live in the fear of the Internal Revenue Service. That's why I'm going to continue to come to the Senate floor and call on Congress to repeal the President's health care law. It is time for Americans to get what they were looking for in the beginning, but do not get as a result of the President's health care law. What they're looking for is the care they need from the doctor that they choose at a lower cost. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Oklahoma is recognized.
Mr. President, I have to say that I enjoy the second opinions when they come from such a well-known doctor who knows what he's talking about. Quite often we in this body are forced to kind of assume that we are experts in every area, so it's nice to have a few who really are. So I think that's a subject that he's, and I don't, this doesn't happen very often, but I actually learn something when I hear him talk. Well, anyway, that's not why I'm here today, Mr. President. I'd like to help provide some sense and balance and accuracy, which is clearly lacking in the mainstream media's attempt to drum up global support, global warming hysteria again. You know, I have to say this, that I feel like we're kind of back to the good old days. We talked about this for about 10 years. And there are different people coming up with legislation, the cap-and-trade legislation. They found out, of course, the American people realized it was a gigantic tax and there are no benefits. And so it kind of went by the wayside. But there's a new thing that's happening, and it was kind of interesting because just last Friday, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, one of the Obama appointees, said to the Associated Press, they said that the wildfires and hot temperatures over the past few weeks are will likely convince Americans that global warming is real. In other words, they're now trying to tie. They've never tried to do this before, because that's one of the few things that all experts agree on, that one isolated case doesn't make a case for major changes in the weather. But and this is kind of a dangerous game to play, because what are they going to say when winter comes? You know, it's going to get cold, and as soon as it turns cold, I can tell you what they're going to say. They're not going to use global warming. They're going to use climate change. So as the season changes, the terminology changes, and they'll start saying just because the temperatures are freezing doesn't mean that the planet isn't overheating. Now, if you follow through with those double negatives there, maybe you understand that. My very good friend from Rhode Island commented on the famous igloo. Put the igloo up there, will you? This was pretty prominent on 2 summers ago, and let me just kind of, Mr. President, tell you the story of where we got to the igloo. As everyone knows, most people know because I brag about it all the time, I've got 20 kids and grandkids, and this happens to be one family here. And this right here, you can't see them as well. That's 6 of the most beautiful people we've ever seen. Happens to be my daughter and her husband and their family of 4 kids. Well, anyway, this would have been in February of 2010. Some of us remember how cold it was during that time. And it happens that one of my kids, the only one who's adopted, is a little girl that was an orphan in Ethiopia that we found and nursed back to health. And my daughter, Molly, who had nothing but boys, she adopted this little girl. Put her picture up there. She's a pretty little girl. And so she's become kind of a hero. Every February, I sponsor something called the African Dinner, where all of our friends from Africa, about 400 of them, come over, and we are establishing close, intimate relations with them. And it happens that that little girl you're looking at there, that was actually 12 years ago that we found her. She's now a 12-year-old little girl. She reads at college level. She's smart, and she's the main speaker every time we have this thing. Well, anyway, in February of 2010, little Zagita Marie was up here, and she brought her whole family up, and she made her speech, and it was a beautiful thing. And afterwards, they were getting ready to take the plane back home, and the blizzards came. And all of the airports in the area shut down. There's no way that they can get back. So what do you do with a family of 6 when you're snowbound and there's nothing but snow and ice on the ground? You make an igloo. So they did, and they put the igloo back up. I mean, that's a real igloo. That's not just something that kids play around. It sleeps 4 people, and I know that. I was in it. But anyway, they did this igloo. It's right up by the Library of Congress, and the sign on top says Al Gore's new home. Well, anyway, and I think they said honk if you want global warming or something like that. Anyway, everyone was having a good time, but some of my liberal friends were so upset. One was Keith Olbermann. Keith Olbermann with MSNBC designated my family, my daughter Molly's family of 6, as the worst family in America. Now, Her husband, very prominent there in Fayetteville, Arkansas. My daughter Molly is a professor at the university. She was actually designated as Outstanding Professor of the Year this year. She'll be marching out on their homecoming on November 3rd to accept that award. Anyway, it's quite an outstanding family, and the kids are all straight A students and all that wonderful stuff. But anyway, that was the famous igloo, and I'll leave it there for a minute because I enjoy, and it's been a long time since we've had a chance to talk about it. So you have Molly and James and Jason, Luke and Jonah and Marie enjoying that. And believe it or not, Mr. President, that's the worst family in America. Well, just after the igloo story broke, a reporter, Dana Milbank, warned the alarmists. Now, keep in mind the terminology we use. Those people who think the world is coming in because catastrophic global warming is coming, it's all due to man-made gases, so we need to shut down America. Those are the alarmists. The skeptics are me, the ones who would look at this and say, wait a minute, that science was cooked up by the United Nations for an ulterior motive. So anyway, Dana Milbank, who's been very much on the other side of this issue, warned the alarmists to stop using weather to justify global warming, because then what do they do when the weather doesn't cooperate with their predictions of the melting planet? And as he wrote, and I'm quoting now, in Washington's blizzards, the Greens were hoisted by their own petard. He concluded, and I'm still quoting, he said, if Washington snows persuade the Greens to put away the slides of polar bears and pine beetles and keep the focus on national security and jobs, it will have been worth the shoveling. But not everyone got that memo. In July, it was July of 2010, the hot summer that followed the intense blizzards, when my family put up the igloo, John Carl of ABC News asked me to do an interview outside in the heat. Now, this is obviously an ambush, and people who know me well know I enjoy ambushes. So I went out there in the heat, and they got ready with the cameras rolling and all this, and they had a pan with an egg in it, and they're going to fry the egg on the pavement, and they put it in there, and it didn't fry. So nice try, but it didn't work. Now, I'm sure you noticed that somebody else tried just last weekend. Last weekend, I happened to be in the Farnborough Air Show, which I go to every year, when I got a call from home that they have kind of resurrected the igloo, and we're talking about that, and they're going to have a great big event on the mall. And in the event, they're going to take the thing called hoax. Now, let me go back to 2003. In 2003, when I realized, and I started hearing from a lot of the scientists, the real scientists, that it was a hoax, I made the comment that the notion that catastrophic global warming is due to man-made anthropogenic CO2 and man-made gases is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. So that's where hoax came. So they're going to had a great big thing made with ice. Apparently, it was about the size of a car that said hoax with a question mark, and they're going to put it down there, and it was going to melt, and they were going to be making a big issue. The problem is nobody showed. So what do? They thought, well, we can't do this. There aren't any cameras here and all that. So they called it off, and they used it as an excuse that there had been a storm up here, and they thought this might be offensive to people who had lost electricity in the storm. Anyway, that thing went under too. So in addition to the recent activity from my alarmist friends, the hot weather has also brought some of my favorite global warming reporters out of hiding, and they have been all too eager to link today's weather events to man-made greenhouse gases. Of course, many of the most outspoken global warming alarmists, scientists, have been happy to play along. But the important point is this, and I want to make this today, is that no one, not even the most committed alarmists, can claim that any percentage of the warm weather is due to man-made greenhouse gases. And I'll go into more details in just a minute. This is an inconvenient truth that global warming reporters have kept out of their headlines, and in some cases their stories as well. Seth Borenstein of the Associated Press, he's a good guy. He's on the other side of this issue, but he's one of these guys that I still like. He's one of the most prominent global warming reporters. He came out last week with another scary headline proclaiming, and I'm quoting this now, quote, "This U.S. summer is what global warming looks like." Similar quotes and stories appeared in Reuters, The Hill, and Politico. And then yesterday morning, Time magazine ran a piece by Byron Walsh with the headline, quote, "Now do you believe in global warming?" And I was happy to see that Mr. Walsh began his article in the Time magazine with a picture of my family here in their igloo. He concluded his piece with a quote, "We're living in an igloo in the summertime, and the ice is melting all around us." It's kind of interesting. This is an article, they talk about warming, but if all of a sudden it's unseasonably cold, they change it to cooling. This was in the New York Times. They said this was when it was a cool summer last year. They said, but this summer has been conspicuously different in New York City. Not one 99-degree day in Central Park, not a single day that the temperature even approached 90. For just the second time in 140 years of record keeping, the temperatures failed to reach 90 in either June or July. The daily average last month was at or below normal every day but 2 days. The temperature broke 80 for 16 days in New York. So it goes on to say that the problem they're having there is it is unusually cool. But that didn't really inure to the benefit of the alarmists, so that wasn't used. So it's time to take a trip down memory lane. Don't forget that Time is the same publication that told us in 1974, told us that we should be very concerned about the coming ice age. There it is. Every magazine, Newsweek had the same thing. All the other magazines said, another ice age is coming, we're all going to die. You know, I would, since there is time to do this, I'll mention one thing that is not in my notes here, that if you just stop and think about how many times this has happened. If you take the last 100 years, starting in 1895, in 1895 to 1925, we went through a 30-year period that was a cooling period. And everyone back there was saying that another ice age is coming, we're all going to die. Then from 1925 to 1945, for that 20-year period, we went through a warming period. And everyone was saying that's when they coined the phrase global warming. That was way back in the 1930s. Well, anyway, from 1945 to 1975, we went into a cooling period. And again, they talked about an ice age is coming, and that's where you had. Then after that, we went into a warming period that went up to the turn of the century. Now it's actually going down into a cooling period again. But that was actually a chart. And I guess what I'm saying here is every 30 or 20 or 30 years, we go through this. And we go through the same hysteria. And everyone goes crazy, and the world's coming to an end. But the interesting thing about this is that the time in the world history when we had the greatest surge of CO2 was right after World War II. That was 1945, and that precipitated not a warming period with all that CO2, but a cooling period that endured for 30 years. And there it is, headlines in the paper. Now, 30 years later, during the height of the global warming movement, they changed their tune. The image that is sealed in everyone's mind and Time magazine cover is the one. There you have it right there. Be worried, be very, very worried. There's the last polar bear standing on the last cube of ice. Everything's melting and we're all going to die again. So, but that's still the same magazine, Time magazine. So you can have it either way. You know, if I were on the board of directors of Time magazine, I'd probably do the same thing. It's a competitive business. You got to sell. But the truth is that even when you ask an alarmist directly, they won't specifically link the recent weather events to human activity. Put I want to put the igloo back up just so people can enjoy it. How do we know this? We recently came across a recorded conference call held by a group called Climate Communications. This is a very liberal group. As their website confirmed, this call was held to feed talking points to reporters on how to link the heat over the past few weeks to man-made global warming. To his credit, AP reporter Seth Borenstein asked the most important question of the call. He asked what percentage of the recent warm weather can be attributed to man-made gases. Now, I want to be completely accurate, so I'd like to quote in full Borenstein's question, as well as the answers that he got from a Dr. Michael Oppenheimer and Dr. Stephen Rooney, two of the foremost global warming alarmist scientists. So this is what Seth Borenstein said. Let me try and put you more on the spot. Mike and Steve, talking to the scientists, I know there's no attribution. You haven't done attribution studies, but if you ballparked it right now and had to put a percentage number on this, on the percent that the heat wave, the percentage of blame, what percentage of blame could you put on anthropogenic climate change? That's man-made climate change on this current heat wave, on the and the fires, and what percentage would the two of you use? And well, Dr. Oppenheimer said, he is a scientist, he said, come on, I'm not going to answer that. Well, yes, I will answer it. My answer is I won't do it. You know that we have to do things carefully, because if you don't, we're going to end up with bogus information out there. People will start disbelieving because you'll be more wrong more often. Still quoting now, this is not the kind of thing I want to do off the top of my head, nor do I think it can be done, you know, convincingly without really doing careful analysis. So I'll pass on this one and see if Steve, that's the other scientist, has a different view. Well, Dr. Steve Renning said, well, I already got way too hypothetical on my last answer. Yeah, it's probably really dangerous for us to just lob out an answer. Well, this goes on and on and on, and I have all this down, which will actually be in the record at this point, but it is redundant, because he keeps trying to get them to say that there's a percentage of chance that this warm weather is due to global warming. Now, we got to stop for a minute, because we're seeing that Seth Bornstein was asking an inconvenient question. One of the moderators tried to step in and tell the AP reporter that his question was a bad one. Let me quote that again. Susan Household, the moderator for the event, Seth, most of the scientists I talked to say it's a controlling factor, and that what we can say, and that it's really not even really a well-posed question to ask for a percentage, just because it's just what you're asking for really, and she stammered around quite a bit, is for a model to determine the chances of this happening without climate change or with climate change, and the models are not very good. So I'd have to see how he responded. He said, I understand. I've been covering this for 20 years. I understand. I don't need a lecture from you. Thank you very much. What I'm asking for is, and he went on and tried to get it. Obviously, he never was able to get it. Here's the irony. Their website specifically explains that the purpose of the call is to give reporters a link relating hot weather to human-caused global warming. It states, quote, Climate Communication hosted a press conference featuring experts discussing the connections between extreme heat and climate change, but when pressed, they couldn't make the link. Again, Bornstein asked a great question, a question that badly needed to be asked. But unfortunately, none of the information appeared in his article for the AP. Without that link, Bornstein was forced to make his article about what global warming could look like in the future. But in doing so, he left out any mention of uncertainty expressed by the scientists. Bornstein quoted Chris Field, a leading author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Keep in mind, that's the United Nations who started this whole thing, and they're the ones who were stacking the scientists, and he was one of the individuals. He said, according to Field, this report warns of unprecedented extreme weather events due to global warming. But as usual, Bornstein failed to mention that even the IPCC, which normally heightens the fear factor as much as possible, admitted in that same March report that there is significant uncertainty regarding linking extreme weather events to human causes. Also missing from the article was the mention of Bornstein's interview with climatologist Judith Curry. Judith Curry was Georgia Institute of Technology. Fortunately, she was good enough to post her answers on her blog since he didn't use it. As Curry explained, quote, we saw these kinds of heat waves in the 1930s, and those were definitely not caused by greenhouse gases. Weather variability changes on a multi-decadal time scales associated with large ocean oscillations. I don't think that what we are seeing this summer is outside the range of natural variability for the past century in terms of heat waves, particularly in cities. Urbanization can also contribute to the warming. Now, there was another interesting part of the conference call that I think is worth mentioning. When ABC News reporter Bill Blakemore asked about the effect of La Nina and El Nino on today's hot weather, Dr. Oppenheimer was again uncomfortable about this question and said it was off message. Yet NOAA, that's the NOAA, came out yesterday and had a different opinion. As Andrew Revkin of the New York Times explained on his blog, in a briefing of several postings today, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reviewed the most notable climate and weather events of 2011. Many of these events, from an extreme East African drought to Australian deluges, were significantly driven by a double-dip La Nina cooling of the tropical Pacific Ocean agency, the scientists said. In other words, it's La Nina and El Nino that made the difference. In yesterday's Tulsa World, there was an opinion piece that directly addressed this El Nino-La Nina debate and how it affects Oklahoma specifically. That's my state of Oklahoma. The editorial mentions an interview in April of 2008 with the Tulsa National Weather Service meteorologist Nicole McGavick regarding Oklahoma's record rainfall that month. As McGavick said, quote, don't go blaming global warming, but rather El Nino's counterpart, La Nina. It happens when the weather is cooler near the equator along the Pacific Ocean. It has nothing to do with global warming. So that same question, the opinion piece, mentioned another article published in December of 2011, which was about Oklahoma's drought-filled summer of 2011. In it, Associate State Climatologist Gary McManus said, and this is a quote, he said, did this hot summer happen due to global warming? No. I think when we study this summer, we will find that we would have had the warmest summer regardless of global warming. With all this in mind, it's no wonder that when Time magazine asked the question, now do you believe in global warming, the answer is resounding. The American people are no longer buying it. You know, as the Washington Post recently reported, global warming is no longer an issue of concern for Americans. And one of the reasons is that the public doesn't trust those who try to use hot weather as proof of global warming. The public has clearly grown weary of the alarmist fear campaigns. After all, they've been going on for 12 years. Now, just how bad have things gotten for the global warming movement? Well, one indication is that no one is even talking about global warming except for myself and Representative Markey over in the House. As a political article said yesterday, Representative Markey accused Republicans of being silent on the threat of global warming and called for Republicans to hold hearings. While Representative Markey is quick to accuse Republicans of silence, he says nothing about the silence that we're hearing from the Democrats here in the United States Senate. We haven't heard anybody. I haven't heard the term global warming coming from any senator. When was the last time anyone heard President Obama or the Democrats mention global warming? In fact, their campaign has failed so miserably that President Obama, running for re-election, is pretending to support oil and gas to gain votes. The irony is that the president who came into office promising to slow the rise of the oceans and all of that has presided over the complete collapse of the global warming movement. Since President Obama took office nearly 4 years ago, not one global warming cap-and-trade bill has been debated on the Senate floor. In fact, if anything, they are regressing in support for their pet issue. Last year, 64 senators went on record in wanting to rein in the Obama EPA's global warming regulations. You know, we've said several times that there have been numerous bills introduced ever since the Kyoto Treaty was never submitted for ratification. That was back in the early 90s. Ever since that time, there have been numerous bills that would be cap-and-trade bills, and they've gone down. Each time they go down by a greater percentage than they did the one before. In fact, if anything, they're regressing in their support. So the far-left environmental community has clearly been instructed to keep quiet, although sometimes they can't help themselves and they get into trouble like the 350.org that I referred to. They are no doubt assured that if President Obama is reelected, he'll do everything he can to achieve his global warming agenda, though through regulation, because the American people have rejected legislation. Well, that's what's happened. And actually, the cost of it, which that is not controversial, it's people recognize, and nobody has actually refuted the fact that if we were to pass either by legislation or by regulation, it would cost the American people between $300 and $400 billion a year. And so people now realize that and know that we can't afford to do something that really is not going to accomplish anything. So anyway, the Obama administration is already doing it. We have identified right now some $68 billion that he has, through regulations, been able to have on all this his climate agenda. So it's been already very, very experienced. Nobody's really aware of it, but nonetheless, that's what is happening. And he just doesn't want the American people to know it. How can he convince them that so much economic pain is necessary now that the global warming movement has completely lost its trust of the public? That won't stop some from the usual suspects from continuing to try to drum up global warming hysteria, but we wouldn't count on Al Gore coming out of a hiding to help him, or President Obama saying anything to back them up, at least not now before the election. You know, it was just the other day, George Mason, I believe it was, University, did a polling of all of the 480 TV meteorologists. Only 19% of them said that we're having global warming due to man-made gases. Now, that's a major change from before. So the trend line's going back the other way. The polling is definitely going the other way. And back to last weekend's failed effort to blame hot weather on global warming, I'd like to mention three things that scientists agree on. First of all, that you can't blame global warming on one event. Let me share with you the Roger Pielke, the professor of environmental studies at the University of Colorado. Over the long term, there's no evidence that disasters are getting worse because of climate change. Judith Curry, I already mentioned her, but additionally, this is another quote by her. She said, this is a well-established scientist. She said, I have been completely unconvinced by any of the arguments that attributes a single extreme weather event, a cluster of extreme weather events, or statistics of extreme weather events to anthropogenic forcing. Miles Allen, the head of a climate dynamics group at the University of Oxford, Atmospheric, Oceanic, and Planetary Physics Department, he said, and this is a quote, when Al Gore said that scientists now have clear proof that climate change is directly responsible for the extreme and devastating floods, storms, and droughts, my heart sank. I was on the Rachel Maddow show. She doesn't very often have Republicans on. She's one of my favorite liberals, and I enjoy being on. And I found out then that Bill Nye, her science guy, actually is one of the things he states is don't fall into the trap of trying to say because something is very, very hot that somehow that supports the global warming. And in fact, Dana Milbank of the Washington Post column, and he's a Rachel Maddow contributor, he said, quote, when climate activists make the dubious claim, as a Canadian environmental group did, that global warming is to blame for the lack of snow at the Winter Olympics in Vancouver, then they invite similar specious conclusions about Washington's snow. Argument by anecdote isn't working. That was Dana Milbank, who's really on the other side of this issue. So I mentioned there are three things. One is is a fact that is incontrovertible, that people agree on. That is that one or two events aren't going to reflect climate or have anything to do with global warming. The second thing is the cost of it. It was, I wasn't, years ago when the Kyoto Treaty was up, I wasn't sure which way to go. I assumed that the scientists were all together on this, only to find out that they weren't. But one thing we did find out when we got a report from several universities, including MIT, that the cost of this, if we were to pass any of the bills, would have been between $300 and $400 billion a year. Now, what I always do when I hear about billions and trillions of dollars, I try to go back and figure out how does that affect my families in the state of Oklahoma. Back when we had the largest tax increase in 1993, called the Clinton-Gore tax increase, that was one, you might remember that. In 1993, they increased marginal rates, death tax, capital gains tax, and all of that. And it was, at that time, the largest tax increase in 3 decades. And we were all pretty outraged about it. yet that was a $32 billion tax increase. Here we're talking about a $300 to $400 billion tax increase. And the last thing I would say is, if you have a tax increase like this, what do you get for it? I sometimes appreciate, in fact, I always appreciate the administrator of the EPA, Lisa Jackson. She was an appointee of President Obama. And I asked her the question live on TV in one of our committee hearings. I said, you know, if you guys are going to do this by regulation, or if you're going to have cap and trade and punish the American people, all the cost of this and everything else, if they're successful, if that happened, would this reduce the CO2 worldwide? Her answer, no, it wouldn't, because this isn't where the problem is. The problem's in China, the problem's in Mexico, the problem's in India. And you could carry that argument on out further and conclude that if you have that kind of a regulation in this country and drive our manufacturing base overseas, they would go to places like China and India where there are no emissions restrictions. So it could have the effect of actually increasing CO2. So anyway, I thought it was, I appreciate very much Time Magazine coming out and bringing up the igloo again. It's a thing of beauty, and it's very meaningful to me, and I think it told a story that a lot of people needed to hear, and they've heard it now. And I'll yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for the recognition. I wanted to come to the floor today to talk about, briefly, the Supreme Court decision on health care. One of the things I want to say is I was in Colorado last week. We had a wonderful time traveling across the whole western slope of our state. Spent time in Gunnison County and other places. We've fished in Hartselle. And one thing people were not talking about there was the Supreme Court decision on health care. What they were talking about was how we get our economy moving again, how we recouple our economic growth in this country to job growth and wage growth again, how we create a comprehensive and thoughtful approach to reducing our deficit and our debt, how we educate our kids for the 21st century, how we build this economy in this country to make sure that we leave our kids with something better than what we found. In short, they were talking about exactly what people in the Beltway are not talking about. Today, the House of Representatives, Mr. President, I don't know whether voting has started yet or not, but is voting to repeal in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, is voting to repeal the health care reform bill for the 31st time. They have been successful 30 times. They have voted to repeal the bill 30 times, but they feel the need now to do it a 31st time. And, Mr. President, I saw on the TV in my office today the Twitter that was going, the traffic that was rolling at the bottom of the screen as one person after another announced gleefully that they were voting to repeal the health care bill for the 31st time. And I thought about a Facebook post I saw last week from somebody I know in Denver named Mary Sewell. She's on the school board there, but she's not a politician. And this is what she wrote the day after the Supreme Court reached its decision on health care. Mary wrote, "Yesterday's Supreme Court decision upholding the Affordable Care Act came on a hard day for our family. Yesterday afternoon, we learned that our 6-year-old Annie has type 1 diabetes. She and I sat in a doctor's office crying through her first finger prick, her first insulin shot. Our life is now different. She will have this disease for her entire life, or until there is a cure. A few years ago, our entire family might have lost our insurance. She now has a pre-existing condition that likely would have made her uninsurable as an adult. What I am saying," Mary wrote, "is not political. It's a mother's sigh of relief. A mother's sigh of relief." When I heard the Supreme Court ruling, I was waiting for the call. I was waiting for the call to tell me why my baby looked too thin, while she had to take breaks walking up a flight of stairs, why she had started wetting her bed. The ruling means she lives in a country that won't leave her behind. We are very lucky that we caught this early, before she lost consciousness or went into a coma, something that would have likely happened in the next few days. I know our luck came from health insurance that allowed her worried parents to take her to the doctor because we had a, quote, bad feeling. Many families, even insured ones, can't do what we did. I was raised on the idea of better to be safe than sorry. Our health care system has been better sorry than safe for too long. Mr. President, Mary goes on to say that the Supreme Court decision couldn't have come at a better time, our family's worst day. I hope that the folks that are twittering out their repeal for the 31st time of this bill, rather than working to try to improve it, rather than working to try to fix it, incapable of actually telling us what they would replace this with, would take a moment to read what a mother in Denver posted on Facebook last week. I don't think this health care bill was perfect, and I've said that from the day that we passed it. There are issues around cost in particular that I continue to be very concerned with, because despite the rhetoric around this place, the reality is that we can't solve our deficit and debt problem in this country without dealing with a restructuring of how we deliver health care in the United States. And maybe this bill isn't perfect, and maybe there are suggestions that could be made to improve it. I have my own. I tried when we passed the bill to put a fail-safe in place that would actually hold this Congress to the numbers that it said it would save, the dollars that we said that we would save, and if we didn't, that we had to figure out how to cut or make other changes to get there. So there's more work to be done. But the thing that I find amazing, and this is why I wanted to come to the floor, Mr. President, is how far away this conversation is from the people that I represent. And what a masquerade so much of this conversation is. I know there were a lot of people that were disappointed that the health care bill was declared constitutional by the Supreme Court, and there were people that said they were going to declare it unconstitutional, and they didn't. And so the next day, and really for the next week, what we heard was, well, the bill imposes a tax on the middle class in this country, that the President broke a promise because he said he wouldn't raise taxes on the middle class. I want everybody to know what's being talked about when people talk about this. They're talking about a piece of the legislation called the health care mandate. Some people call it a penalty, and some people call it a tax. That's something that's been debated around here for the last week. It hasn't been debated before this, and I don't care what label you put on it, frankly, because people at home are not talking to me about this. And you know why they're not talking to me about this? Because it applies to 1%, 1.2% to be precise, of the American people. That's what the Congressional Budget Office told us when we were passing this legislation, and if you don't believe me, it is on page 37. Mr. President, I won't enter the whole opinion into the record. Maybe it's page 33 of the Supreme Court's finding of fact, where Justice Roberts finds as a matter of fact that the CBO said this mandate would cost $4 billion and that roughly 4 million people would be affected. Those are the 4 million people after Medicare and Medicaid and private employers' insurance and personal insurance that people buy. That is a group of people, a sliver, 1% of the American people that can afford to buy insurance but don't, and choose to pay the penalty or the tax or the mandate instead of buying their insurance. $4 billion, 4 million people. What the health care bill was intended to do, and again, may not have done perfectly, and there may be other ideas that we ought to be legislating around, what it was intended to do was solve a problem that confronted not 1% of the American people, not 4 million people, but a problem that conservatively, extremely conservatively, affects 50% of the American people, and is a $58.5 billion problem, not a $4 billion problem. Because It's 50% of the people that are covered today by their employer who have to pay $1,100 a year in premiums, in additional premiums, to subsidize the uninsured in the United States of America. That was one of the big objectives of dealing with this health care issue. And I say it's conservative because this number doesn't even include the people that are buying insurance on their own. And so maybe if you add those numbers together, you get to about 70% of the American people. So we spent a week on the cable television, on the floor of the Senate, occupied completely with this 1% number over here, with no theory at all about what we're doing for 50% of Americans. That's how comical this conversation has become. I shouldn't say comical. That's how detached this conversation has become from what's actually going on in the real lives of the people that I represent and others in this chamber represent. And what's so amazing to me, having watched this as somebody who has not been around here for very long and may not understand all the ways of Washington, is that when you look at the history of this so-called mandate or so-called tax, it's really puzzling to understand the politics around it. This is a chart that is part of an article that ran in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago called The Unpopular Mandate by Ezra Klein, and I'd ask, Mr. President, that the entire article be made part of the record.
Without objection.
And I'd urge people to read this because what Mr. Klein does in this article is chart the political course of this mandate from about 1989 to the present. And the red are the years in which this was a Republican idea, advanced by Republican members of Congress and by think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, who actually came up with the idea to begin with, to deal with the fact that there were people in this country that weren't buying health insurance and that we were all subsidizing. And then when it became a Democratic idea in more recent times. Strikes me as one person watching all of this that this might have more to do with the party that's in the White House or not in the White House than it does with respect to the merits of the idea. But it's, of course, the merits of these ideas that we should be debating and talking about. But we shouldn't be telling the American people that something that affects 1% of the American people is a broad-based assault on the middle class. And we should be bringing to this floor the ideas we have for improving what 50% of the American people or 70% of the American people are already facing. That is what people in our state believe. Here's part of an editorial from the Greeley Tribune, which I think was published yesterday, where they wrote, in 2010, the North Colorado Medical Center provided more than $71 million in services to indigent patients who didn't have health insurance. It wrote off another $29 million in bad debt. Eventually, the Greeley Tribune writes, insured patients must pay for that in higher premiums and co-pays. Mr. President, I'd ask that that editorial be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. So what I want to say is I believe that folks in Colorado have moved on here, that they want us to improve this legislation, that they want us to get focused on the real matters at hand, which is getting this economy going again, getting us into an environment where we have rising jobs and rising wages again, and they're a lot less interested in these talking points. I don't understand why people that are in politics can simultaneously make such a big deal about this. It affects 1% of the people in this country. And at the same time support legislation, for example, that forces women, that mandates women to have procedures before they can make a choice about their own reproductive health. It doesn't make any sense because it's completely inconsistent. And I have a daughter, Annie, who's 7, not 6 like Mary's, but it's her health care and the certainty in her life and in her sister's life and the thousands of children across my state whose health care we should be interested in. So I can see that other colleagues of mine have come to the floor, so I'm going to move along here. But I want to just, before I do that, and before I yield to the senator from Maryland, say that if this repeal happened in the House, and then this repeal happened in the Senate, and it were signed into law, 932,000 Coloradans who have pre-existing conditions would lose their insurance. 50,000 young adults in Colorado who can now stay on their parents' insurance until they're 26 would no longer be able to. Women could once again be discriminated against simply because they're women. It's welcome to 696,000 women in Colorado that need maternity care or other women's health services, that they're not going to be charged higher premiums since this law is in effect. And when these exchanges are set up, 521,000 Colorado children will, for the first time, have better vision and dental coverage. I want to work in a bipartisan way going forward to try to make sure we're doing everything we can to follow the examples of places like St. Mary's Hospital in Grand Junction or the University of Colorado Hospital in Denver or Denver Health in Denver to drive higher quality and to drive lower costs. It's essential. It's essential for our economy. It's essential for our competitive position in the world. And it's essential that we put these talking points down and start actually dealing with the facts as they are. And with that, Mr. President, I thank you for your patience and I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Maryland.
First, let me thank Senator Bennett for his comments as it relates to the Affordable